Hey guys, I'm Heidi Prieb. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. This month on this channel, we're talking about integrity. And today in particular, I want to talk about defensiveness. So this is a video that I've actually had in the back of my head for a long time, but I was waiting for when it felt like the right time to dive into the topic. And this month, when we're talking about self-respect and how to show up in a way that we're proud of inside of our close relationships, it felt like the perfect opportunity to finally bring in the topic of defensiveness. Now, this is a topic that I think gets a really bad rep, somewhat undeservedly so. So, very often, if we're talking about someone and saying that they're very defensive, or when we're accusing someone of being defensive, we're kind of subtly implying that they are being irrational, or that what they're saying doesn't really hold weight. And what I want to talk about today is how to actually use the experience of defensiveness to our advantage. So, how to stop or pause when we feel ourselves getting defensive and actually figuring out, is there something here that it's actually really important for me and my integrity to stand up for? So, this is about transforming defensiveness into assertiveness. And we're going to talk about this at length in terms of what process brings us there. But I just want to state off the bat that I think that there's often very strong signal inside of feelings of defensiveness. So I don't think that we should instantly dismiss them as being irrational, even if we recognize that there's something not entirely rational inside of our thought process around it. So we're going to go into exactly how to sort out what needs to be kept and defended in a healthy and assertive way, as well as how to acknowledge and admit to ourselves that we might also have some muddle around the way that we're going about arguing our point. This is the process of figuring out how to not self-abandon in the moments where we're not actually sure what it is that we're feeling upset about. And I believe this is an incredibly important skill for secure relating. So it's really worth it to spend some time on this. Step one in this process is just figuring out so that we start to be aware of this in the moment. Which signals show up in our body to let us know that we are feeling defensive? And again, when we're feeling defensive, this is not necessarily cause for us to go, okay, time to shut down everything I'm feeling and admit that I'm wrong. This is the experience of just being able to recognize in a completely neutral way, I am feeling defensive. So right now, what you can try doing is pulling into your body a memory of the last time or a recent time that you felt defensive. And just notice what changes happen inside of your physiology as you're recalling that memory. Defensiveness does look and feel different to different people. So for some of us, we might go into a total shutdown response when we feel defensive and kind of tell ourselves these stories about how this other person could never understand us, so we're not even going to bother. But for other people, it feels really upregulating. So when you're feeling defensive, you might feel this mix of kind of panic and anger. Or maybe you feel the really strong urge to explain yourself and to tell the other person as much information as you can about what it is that they're getting wrong. And so what we just want to do in this first step is start becoming aware of what happens in our body when that feeling of defensiveness is online. And what we are not trying to do is completely get rid of this feeling. Actually, we want to welcome it in so that the next time we notice it showing up, instead of immediately switching into whatever response we usually take when we feel defensive, whether that's shutting down or lashing out or anything else in between, we can just name it for ourselves. In a neutral way, we can just tell ourselves, I am feeling defensive right now. And if we happen to be in a relational dynamic where it feels safe to disclose that to the other person, I really highly recommend doing that as well. So just taking a breath and going, I'm feeling really defensive in this conversation. Or I'm feeling a lot of resistance to what we're talking about in this conversation, or the way this conversation is unfolding, or something like that. That gives you a moment to kind of acknowledge where you're at before deciding what to do next. So I've been on both sides of this equation, and I can say that from the receiving end, when someone tells me overtly that they're feeling defensive, it's actually kind of like them putting out a safety cone in the conversation. Because now I know there's some heightened emotions going on, right? So we're going to need to tread a little bit more carefully. But again, you're going to need to use your discretion as to whether or not you want to disclose that. which leads into how we want to tackle step 2. Step 2 of this process is figuring out where both the signal and the muddle is inside of your defensiveness response. So these are terms that a close friend of mine always uses that I find really, really helpful in navigating through these situations. So where is the signal? Where is the part of me that actually knows I need to stand up for myself here versus where is the muddle? Where am I actually getting a bit confused and making a case that doesn't necessarily apply? Where is my cause and effect reasoning not quite clear here? So this step can be done interpersonally with the other person you're in conversation with, if there's a high degree of trust there. But if not, this might be something that you want to ask for a couple of minutes to excuse yourself from the conversation and kind of sit with yourself and try to sort this out. And there is one question that I encourage you to ask yourself when you're trying to figure out where the signal and the muddle is in your feelings of defensiveness. And that question is, what would it mean if I were wrong about this? So if someone makes a comment and we immediately feel like, no, you've got it wrong, I have to over-explain myself, or you have misunderstood me, I need to completely shut down, what we want to focus on is if this other person were actually right about that thing, even if in reality we actually know for a fact that they're wrong, what would it mean if they were right and I were wrong? And what that's going to help me surface is the meaning that I'm making out of their statement that is deeper than the actual statement that they're making. So, for example, years ago, I had an Instagram account that was dedicated to some writing that I was doing at the time. And my work started gaining some traction, and I started getting a following on Instagram. And I had this one friend at the time who would always kind of make jokes with me about, oh, now that you're a big-time influencer. And what was interesting to me was that I didn't have any negative connotation associated with the word influencer. I had friends who were influencers and who did sponsored posts, and I thought, good on them, it's like any other job. But I got the sense that this person was saying it in a slightly derogatory way. So I would always feel defensive when that word came up. And I didn't know whether or not that was true, right? I didn't know for sure if they were implying something negative or not. But I sat with that question and went, what I'm making this mean is that they don't respect my writing and the fact that I share it online. So my instinct was to push back against the label of influencer because I felt like that didn't accurately describe what I did in the sense of I just literally was not an influencer. I was not selling any products. But there is a subtext to it. So arguing back against the influencer status for me was not just arguing that I wasn't an influencer. It was arguing that I thought I deserved this person's respect. And those are actually two separate conversations. So this is about figuring out which things we're lumping together that actually are two different things. So clarifying that I wasn't an influencer was one conversation, but talking to this friend about the feeling I had that they didn't respect my work was a different conversation. And so this is what we want to do with this question. We want to get clear on what meaning am I perceiving to be behind this question, whether or not I'm right about that. So I find that very often what happens when we identify a person as very defensive is that we are saying something to them that might be kind of benign to us, but that carries a very deep unconscious meaning for them that feels like an attack. So for a lot of us, there are a lot of things that just kind of feel neutral about our personalities. Like if someone came up to me and went, Heidi, you're pretty bad at tennis, right? I'd be like, yeah, I am bad at tennis. I think I've played it like one time in my life when I was 12. So I would be very surprised if I went to go play a game of tennis and found out that I were good at it. So the comment that I was bad at tennis wouldn't feel loaded in any way. But now, let's say I grew up in a family where there was a super strong tennis culture. And everyone loved tennis, except for me. I didn't really like it, but I felt like I kind of had to play it to fit in with the culture. Now, if someone comes up to me and goes, Heidi, you're not very good at tennis, right? I might instinctively translate that in my mind to mean, Heidi, you're not good enough for your family, right? And so now I have to start pushing back and defending that actually I do know how to play tennis. I just haven't been out much this year and I haven't been hitting the courts, but it's because work has been swamped. And what I'm actually fighting back against in this situation is not the original claim itself. It's the meaning underneath the claim. I'm trying to argue that it's okay that I don't like tennis and I should still be accepted. But they might not have any idea of that. If let's say this is just a coworker of mine who was trying to figure out if I was going to be interested in playing on the company tennis team. So these are the areas where I think that we're most prone to calling somebody defensive, is when they have a very strong unconscious interpretation of something that we have almost no underlying unconscious interpretation of. And that's very often where these big mismatches happen. So if we want to try to be less defensive, the first thing we want to work on is getting clear on which really heavily loaded unconscious interpretations we have to fairly benign comments that other people might make. But I also want to point out that this is not to say everybody else is always operating in good faith. So in the second part of this video, what we're going to talk about is how to deal with scenarios where it feels like maybe we actually are being insulted by someone, they're just not doing it in an overt way. So an example of this would be if I came from that family where tennis culture was so strong, and one of my cousins who had a long history of bullying me came to visit me in my workplace and was joking with all my coworkers about what a bad tennis player I was. That might be a scenario where there actually is real signal in the fact that I feel defensive, because I actually am kind of covertly being insulted. So what we want to do here is try to get really clear on which situation is which. And in the second part of this video, we're going to go over how to deal with every possible version of that, including versions where we truly don't know if the other person is mocking us or if we are just being overly sensitive because we know that we have a really loaded interpretation around that thing. But in this step, the only thing we're paying attention to is, what do I think it means if this thing that this person is saying that I feel defensive around is true? What meaning am I making out of it? We have to get to that meaning, or else we can't do the rest of the steps in this process. Another example of this, to give some varieties. When I was in university, I remember the first time my father, who was a very cleanliness is next to godliness kind of person, came to visit me. He immediately kind of walked through my house and started pointing out all of the places where I was not being tidy and making a lot of comments about the mess in the place. And I remember getting really, really defensive about that. And I didn't have the language for it at the time, but the meaning I was making out of it was that if I am messy or untidy, it means I am lazy. And I automatically assumed that that was what he was implying about my place. And the truth was that I was not lazy. The reason my place was not super clean was because I was working 3 part-time jobs and going to school full-time. So I would often work a midnight till 8 a.m. shift and then go do a full day of classes and then nap for a few hours and then work a shift at my evening job. And this didn't leave me a lot of spare time to devote to housework. So the truth was that my place was a bit messy, but I didn't want to be seen as lazy. So what I immediately started doing was lashing out at him. And I went, well, you have militaristic standards for cleanliness, and no reasonable person could ever live up to that, and making it all about him having an unrealistic bar for cleanliness, when in reality, there was both signal and muddle in what was happening for me. The signal was that I did want to be respected and seen for how hard I was working. The muddle was that instead of admitting, yes, my place is a mess, but there's a reason for that, and I really want you to see how hard I'm working in these other areas, and it hurts that you aren't recognizing that. I was trying to convince him that actually my place was not a mess, and that was untrue. So that was the muddle. I was trying to argue my underlying point by distorting my surface level one. But this is often a really tricky thing to get clear on, especially if we grew up in environments or find ourselves in environments where passive aggressiveness genuinely is a tool that people use very often to communicate things they don't like about us or that they wish we would change. So step 3 in this process is figuring out, is the insult that I'm feeling defensive about personal? So is this a way that I am judging myself that the other person actually isn't implying at all? So this would be the case with, let's say, one of my coworkers asking me whether or not I was good at tennis and me getting all flustered about it. I would be instinctively judging my worth as a person around whether or not I was good at tennis, whereas it's likely that my coworker was not doing that even a little bit. So this would be a case where feelings of defense and insult are personal. Or is it interpersonal? Which means, is this person actually insulting me covertly here? Which is somewhat often the case, right? Or is it neither, or is it both? So we're going to look at what all of these look like. But first, we just want to note that the route to figuring out which it is through reality testing. So once we have surfaced that story, that meaning that we're making out of the comment that someone has made, then we just want to be clear with them. Hey, I'm interpreting what you're saying as this. Am I getting that right or am I making that up? So if I had had the language for it that time that I was in university and my dad came to visit me, I could have said, hey, I'm interpreting your critique of my house as you calling me lazy. Am I right about that or am I wrong about that? Or in the case of my friend continuously implying that I'm an influencer in a tone of voice that I found kind of suspect, I eventually went up to that friend and said, hey, it's not technically true that I'm an influencer and that's actually not my job, but I don't really have any problem being thought of as an influencer. But I feel a little uncomfortable around the way that you say it because I haven't heard you in the past talk very positively about influencers. And so I'm wondering if there's some judgment there, or if there's something you don't respect about the fact that I put my writing on the internet. And what this does is it gives the person the option to do one of three things. One, they can admit that, yes, actually, I was kind of taking a dig at you there. I find this is pretty unlikely. It takes an exceptionally honest person to do that, but it is one of the options. Or if they genuinely did not mean something that way and it was a true misunderstanding, they can also let you know that. So that's usually going to sound something like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. That is not at all what I meant. I really don't want you to think that that's what I think of you, right? You can usually feel when someone's being authentic in that way. And three is they might deny it in a way that you feel is probably not the truth. So they might go, of course not, you're just being too sensitive, right? And give some sort of dismissive response. But the reason why this is an important step is because if it is a true, genuine misunderstanding, it can stop here, right? Then there's no reason to continue defending the self. And you've just expressed something vulnerable to another person. Because when we explain the things that we feel self conscious about, it is a vulnerable thing. And now they know you better, right? So we want to reality test this at least to rule out option two, which is that it's just a misunderstanding. But here's what we do with the other things. What we want to figure out is the following. We want to look at, am I feeling defensive because something has poked at something in me that I judge myself for? Or is this something I don't judge myself for? So we want to clarify which of those two things it is. And then we want to look at, do I think the other person is being genuinely disrespectful towards me or not? And this will give us 4 different scenarios that we can respond to in 4 different ways. So let's say in the influencer example, my friend goes, oh my God, no. I'm so sorry. This is not at all what I meant. I actually think it's really cool and I really respect your work. Now what we have is a misunderstanding. I respect myself and they respect me. So in that case, we can probably patch it up pretty easily, laugh it off, and now maybe they have a little bit more information about the fact that I do sometimes get judged for that. And maybe that's something they didn't know. But what happens if I do that same reality testing and I get the same response from them that, oh my God, that's not at all what I meant. But I realize I still feel kind of agitated that they noticed that this is something that I do and that they use that label. Maybe it turns out I actually have a problem with that label. And there's something they're pointing out that I'm actually mad at myself for. Now we're in a situation where I don't respect myself, but the other person does. And in this case, what we probably want to do is apologize for having projected that onto them, and then look at how we want to heal our own self-relationship with the part of us that judges ourselves. Whether that means changing what we do or just becoming more comfortable and accepting of something that we do. But let's say I don't get that totally understanding and apologetic second response from people where they genuinely do respect me. Let's say I get one of the other responses. So either, yeah, I actually was insulting you, and the meaning that you're making out of that statement is correct. Again, you don't get a lot of this, but it might happen. Or someone dismissing your meaning making and acting like you're crazy, or of course they didn't mean that, but in a way where you're not fully convinced. So now you're in a scenario where if you have self-respect around the thing that you think this person is insulting you for, but they don't seem to be respecting you, you want to look at which boundaries you can draw around this. And what I've found is that in scenarios where people are doing that kind of denial game, but I don't really believe it, it's really helpful to treat it as though it's in this category and say, even as a hypothetical, okay, I appreciate that you weren't trying to insult me, but just so you know, if you really did disrespect what I did, that would be a pretty big issue for me in our friendship. because I respect what I do, and I feel really uncomfortable if you're kind of mocking me around this thing. And even if it's phrased as a hypothetical, and even if they dismiss you as being overly sensitive, they will hear the boundary that you're putting down. That doesn't necessarily mean they'll respect it in the future, but people hear us when we set boundaries, even in hypothetical forms. And now they understand if I continue behaving in this way, this person is not going to find it funny, and they are going to stand up for themselves assertively. And then if it happens again, the conversation might need to happen again, right? I don't feel comfortable with the way that you bring this up, or I don't find that joke is funny. Could you please stop making it? This is healthy assertiveness. You're addressing the subtext of what's being said, even if it's just hypothetically, and letting them know, in a hypothetical situation where that is what you mean, I'm not here for it, and I will not take that kind of treatment. And this is going to get you a lot further in the long run than arguing back endlessly against the surface point, if you believe that there truly is a subtext. And of course, if they admit that there is one, then it's time to draw some explicit boundaries. I'm not okay with you talking about my house like this. I understand that you think it's messy and it's not up to your standards, but I have a lot on my plate. This isn't something that I think is a priority for me to attend to. And quite frankly, I'm not going to want to have you over if you're just going to come and criticize the way that my place looks. So this is where we need to get clear about our boundaries and stand up for ourselves and the part of us that feels put off and defensive in a clear and assertive way. And then we're going to look at the last quadrant. So what if you surface that the other person is insulting you around something that actually you also feel a lot of shame around and that you don't respect yourself for? This is the quadrant where we have 2 harms that we need to attend to, not 0. So sometimes we're quick to go, well, they're kind of disrespecting me around this, but I also don't respect myself around this, so those cancel each other out and I should just leave it alone. In reality, what we want to be doing is attending to both. So this is where we have a conversation about how to talk about this thing. So let's say I have made it clear to my friend that I don't really respect the work that I do. But then they also start making fun of my work in front of other people, and maybe I'm uncomfortable with that. In this case, it's time to have a conversation with this friend about how to talk about the issue. Hey, I know that I complain about my work and I don't really like it, and I feel kind of embarrassed about what I do, but I don't appreciate you making jokes about it in front of other people. That feels really crappy to me. And sometimes you surface some really important things out of this, right? Maybe you are endlessly complaining about your work to your friend, and they're getting frustrated because they feel like they're putting a lot of time and energy into trying to help you sort out the problem, but you're not taking action on it. And so maybe these quips that they're making are their way of kind of venting some frustration about the fact that they feel like their listening skills are being taken advantage of by you. So this can surface some really interesting things that might be happening under the surface of the relationship dynamic if you can address it directly. Another example of this dynamic that I find is fairly common is, let's say you are making relationship decisions that you know are not great for you, or that are not really coming out of a place of self-respect, and you're telling your friends about it. And then the next time you go to them and you're like, ooh, actually, I haven't taken any of their advice or done any of the things that I said I would do to set boundaries in my relationship. And then them just asking, hey, how's your relationship going, can put you instantly on the defense. Because them asking that question to you might have a subtext that goes, if I have not taken their advice or implemented what I said I was going to implement, it means that I am pathetic or unworthy or whatever it is. And this is a case where you might need to approach that conversation with just as much transparency as possible. I'm disappointed in the way that I'm acting around this, and I don't really know why I keep acting this way around this. And I know that you guys are probably frustrated too. So let's talk about how we can talk about this issue in a way that isn't making both of us perpetually frustrated. Right? You bring the elephant into the room. But the thing that's really important here, and what we just want to make sure we are paying attention to, is where there is signal inside of our feelings of defensiveness. Usually when we get defensive, it's because there is a part of us that genuinely wants us to stand up for ourselves. We just aren't super clear on what that part is and where it's getting confused inside of the scenario. So we have to make that explicit, separate what's different about the conversation we're having and the meaning that we're making out of it, reality testing whether that meaning is actually being implied in the conversation or not, and then responding accordingly by being assertive in the right area that actually gets at the core of what's happening under the surface of our conversations. And the more comfortable we get doing this, the less defensive we naturally become. And the more clean and clear we start getting on what these underlying dynamics in our relationships that we might feel so perpetually frustrated by are, and how we can address them more often at the root. All right, that's all I'm going to say for today on this topic. As always, any questions, thoughts, comments you guys have coming up as you've gone through this video, do leave them in the comments section below. I love you guys. I hope you're taking care of yourselves and each other, and I will see you back here again really soon.